Welcome to The Nation and our budget special. The man in charge of the country's purse strings eased them just a fraction in this year's budget. There was a mere $900 million worth of new spending, and that keeps Bill English on track towards an operating surplus of $75 million in 2014-15. So what sweeteners will he offer in election year? Finance Minister Bill English joins me in studio this morning. Hello, Mr English. Thank you for coming in this morning. Good morning. So in this budget, we show a fairly optimistic plan here, really, for growth. How certain are you that you're going to meet these forecasts?
We're more certain than we have been in the last 3 or 4 years, and that's because the global situation still has its risks and challenges, but looks a little bit more settled than, say, a couple of years ago. On the one hand, and on the other hand, New Zealanders have adapted very well through the recession, sorted out a lot of issues about their household finances and their businesses, and I just sense a lift in confidence that we are able to handle the situation and grab the opportunities we have.
If we look at budget day GDP forecasts and we can see a graph, I think we can bring that up now, that shows that you've essentially had to revise them each year. So in 2011, we forecast 4% growth this year. Then last year, we revised that down to 2.6 and then revised it this year down to 2.5. So these are volatile, these forecasts, aren't they? Why should we believe these forecasts? Well,
they are volatile because the world's been pretty changeable. Treasury does the forecasts. It's their best professional judgment at the time with the information that they have. I think the way the government's characterised it is not to chase the figures month to month or even quarter to quarter, but we're on a track of moderate growth, 2 to 3%. By international standards, it's pretty good. And we're focusing on the longer term structure in the economy to improve it, not just on the shorter term numbers.
Well, you talk about long term, but Rob McLeod from Ernst & Young, he said this week, predicting GDP beyond 12 months in today's environment is not much better really than guesswork. Is he right?
Well, he understands the economics of it pretty well. And our approach to that is to focus on the things we can control. It's not as if because the forecasts are 0.5% up, everyone puts their feet up. Of course they don't, because both the government, businesses, households are all working on how to be more competitive, how to lift our incomes and create more jobs in a pretty challenging world.
Nonetheless, it's on these forecasts that we have this knife-edge surplus of, it's pretty tiny, $75 million. That surplus does rely on these forecasts being right, though, doesn't it?
Well, it does roughly. I mean, the government has, as we've got closer to getting to surplus, we're a bit more confident each year that the patterns that are getting us out of deficit are embedded, and that is tax revenue reasonably solid and a bit better than expected, and good control of expenditure. We need to keep the $75 million in context. 3 years ago, the deficit was $18 billion. This next financial year, it'll be $2 billion. So we've made major progress, and we're pretty confident of getting to surplus.
What do you do in the next budget if this week's forecast figures prove too optimistic, as we've just seen in Australia?
Well, we've got a bit of room to move. I think the difference between us and Australia is that we haven't had a big burst of tax revenue, which they got through the mining expansion, that some of which got built into spending. I mean, we're coming out of a background of recession rather than rapid growth. So we're pretty confident that the forecasts are conservative enough and we can get to that surplus.
You're pretty confident you'll get to that surplus, even though it's pretty small and it's on a knife edge?
Well, a government's always got choices, and over the last few years we've, along with the rest of New Zealand, made conservative, careful choices that have enabled us to continue to invest in growing the future capacity of the economy at the same time as getting our books back to surplus. And some of the international agencies like the IMF have endorsed that strategy. OK,
the IMF have also said this week, they've been a little bit in your ear, they said the causes of low household savings will need to be addressed to reduce pressure on the exchange rates and to lower current account deficits. They want you to act on this issue, but you haven't done anything, have you?
Well, that's not correct. I mean, through our budgets over the last few years, we have taken a number of angles on the savings issue, pretty significant reform of our tax system that cut the tax on savings. More recently, the government share offers, which give savers better opportunities for investment. I think there's quite a lot of work to do now to understand just why New Zealanders behave the way they do. We've been inclined in the last 20 years just to say most people have got it wrong, they're not saving enough. And I've been discussing with the Treasury and the Reserve Bank, we need to dig down further into that, because New Zealanders won't all be wrong. They've got good reasons for making the decisions they make, and we need to understand that better before we take another significant step in encouraging savings.
What could you do to incentivise people to save?
Well, look, there's quite a lot of incentives there. Kiwi Saver's got an incentive to build, and it's been a successful scheme. I think we should give it, New Zealand should give itself a bit of credit, including the last government, for setting up that Kiwi Saver scheme. It's got 2 million New Zealanders in there, a lot of whom would not be saving. We are providing opportunities for investment on a large scale through the share floats. I think we are, these things take a long time to shift, and I think we're creating a more positive environment for New Zealand savers. Action on the housing market to deal with runaway prices there, I think, is also an important part of the equation.
Okay, let's look at the budget itself. No sooner had you announced it this week, then Standard & Poor's put 8 banks on notice. And they said, again, coming back to this current account deficit issue, we consider there's an increasing risk that a sharp correction in property prices could occur. And they say that risk is heightened by this. You do have to do something. You do need policy, though, don't you, to make people save?
Well, Standard & Poor's did 2 things. One is they endorsed the government's fiscal approach, as the IMF did, to getting back to surplus. And secondly, that the putting those banks on watch is on negative watch is a warning about the state of our housing market. We are unusually highly valued by world standards, and prices have been going up quite rapidly by world standards. And we agree with that risk, and that is why today, as we speak, Parliament is debating legislation we introduced with the budget to provide for housing accords and to provide the tools for councils and government to increase the supply of housing into the market. Because when you look around the world, you see countries like Spain, Ireland, the US, where when the bubble bursts, you get some real economic destruction.
Is there anything more that the Reserve Bank can do?
Well, in the budget, we've had a package of measures focused on housing, the legislation I've just talked about. But alongside that, we signed up for the first time to these so-called macro-prudential tools, which are ways of the Reserve Bank ensuring that banks remain safe and that banks don't overextend themselves on lending. And together, it is a pretty significant shift in the environment for our housing market, and I think significant enough to have some impact over the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay. Your critics say there's nothing structural in this, nothing significant in this budget that will trigger any real change. So the best you can do, is it, to guarantee, future surpluses, is to freeze government spending?
Well, look, I think that that kind of criticism just doesn't quite understand how the economy is evolving. There isn't one big thing that makes a fundamental change in the economy. The only time that happens is when you have a crisis. So this budget is part of a considered program focused on increasing jobs and incomes. There are certainly structural measures in it. The ones we've just talked about are housing, the most comprehensive, biggest structural measures around the housing market for a long, long time, and will make have the potential to make a lasting difference to how our housing market operates, and that housing is our biggest single asset, so that's certainly structural.
Okay, where are the jobs, though, going to come from here? Where are the jobs in this budget? Where's the job creation?
Well, the job creation comes from the businesses, and when you get to talk to the business people today, I think they will underline that. So we're creating the conditions that enable them to make the decisions to invest and employ. When you look at the forecasts for jobs, and they're just forecasts, so not promises or guarantees, they're going to come from a continuing growth in our export sector, which has been growing for the last 2 or 3 years despite all the headwinds, and from the nationwide effect of the Christchurch rebuild and a pick-up in domestic construction in Auckland.
There's also, though, forecast wage growth of 4.7% by 2015. Is that problematic?
Look, we've had the benefit, and households in New Zealand have actually come through this recession in pretty good shape. A lot of it because of their resilience, and a lot of it because there's been a pretty steady approach to the economic management. So New Zealanders have got the lowest interest rates in 50 years. Their dollar can buy more than it has for a long time, and most of them have had moderate, and I'd stress moderate wage increases each year, and that's what we're expecting to continue over the next 4 or 5 years.
You're also cutting ACC levies. What impact is that going to have on the average Kiwi wage?
Well, the details of that will become clear later in the year, but it's a good example where just one part of the public sector is being managed much better now, and we can pass, 20-30% reductions back to people added to previous ones. It'll be 40% reductions in ACC levies, and that will affect every pay packet because every pay packet has an ACC levy on it. Details later in the year.
So, okay, we've had no radical changes in this budget. Nothing major. Most of the critics would say, what are you going to have up your sleeve for next year? Election year, you need to have a little sweetener in here. What have you got planned?
I wouldn't people shouldn't expect significant shift from this government in election year. An election year budget, the last election year budget was one of the tightest budgets in a long, long time, a zero budget. We'll continue with a pretty similar program, and that is to move along through the economy as we've done with housing and ACC this time, with further reform that is going to improve our competitiveness and invest in our future capacity for growth. That's been a longer term view, and we'll also continue with reaching surplus and improving our public services. And we've built up a track record in that now. People should expect it to continue next year.
Okay, Minister for Finance, Bill English, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.